What's up, wizards? Welcome back to Across the Horizon, a collaborative project between Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology and Michael Beeson of Hacking Fate. I'm Michael Beeson, and with me is Christopher Warnock. And I will go ahead and get us started with the 18th aphorism. We'll start with the Ashmand translation. If, while a benefic may ascend, both the luminaries should be in the same minute, the native will be equally and highly prosperous in all things which can befall him. So, likewise, if the luminaries be mutually opposed by the east and west, but the contrary effect will be produced should a malefic be on the ascendant.
Okay, so this is Partridge. When both luminaries are in the same degree and minute of a sign at the time of anyone's birth, and a benevolent planet in the horoscope, the person then born shall be fortunate in all his actions. The same will also be if the two lights behold each other by opposition from the first and seventh, qualified as before. But if an unfortunate be in the horoscope, judge the contrary.
Okay, and I will round us out with Coley. When the sun and moon are in one and the self-same degree and minute at the time of anyone's birth, and a benevolent planet is lord of the ascendant, the native at that time born shall be fortunate in all his actions. The same shall happen if the two lights be in opposition, the one in the ascendant, the other in the seventh house, so qualified as before. But if an infortune be placed in the ascendant, you may well judge the contrary.
Okay, so we're talking about natal astrology, obviously, and we've got this sort of set of potential conditions that they are set up. So basically what you're dealing with is we're dealing with the two lights, the sun, which is the light of the day, and the moon, which is the light of the night, which are known as the luminaries. And we also deal with the benefics. So the greater benefic is Jupiter and lesser benefic is Venus. And so what this is saying is that if the sun and the moon are in exactly the same minute and degree, and which would be Cazimi, I mean, depending on the definition of Cazimi, usually it's 16 minutes. So there's various ways of judging it, but 16 minutes is what I typically use in the heart of the sun, which is considered to be very, very positive. And Picatrix has a lot of positive things to say about the moon being Cazimi. Then so they have to, that's going to be unusual too, because the moon is so fast that it's only going to be for a very short time. I mean, that could be like minutes that the moon could be within the same minute. It's moving so fast that that's going to be an extremely short time. So this is pretty unusual for this to happen at all. For someone to be born at exactly the point where the moon is at the degree and minute of the sun is unusual. Then you also need to have, says, a benefic, so Venus or Jupiter. Now, this is what's interesting with these different translations. 2 out of the 3, Ashmand and Partridge, say benefic rising, right? Whereas Coley says a benefic ruling the ascendant. Okay, so that's interesting. So if you've got the sun and the moon together, and then you've got a benefic rising, then the person's that's supposed to be great. Everything happens, you're gonna be a totally lucky person. Okay, well it's not too crazy. I mean, obviously, like I said, the Cazimi is considered to be really good. A benefic is good. So Cazimi and a benefic rising, I mean, sounds like that would be pretty good. It's kind of wacky though, because then they say if they're opposing each other, the sun and the moon from the first and seventh. So it's like, okay, because generally an opposition would be considered to be negative, right? But again, you need to have that benefic rising or ruling the ascendant, as Coley says. But they said the contrary, if you have was it a malefic, right? Then it's not so good.
Malefic rising, yeah.
Yeah. So that's what's interesting about it is, like, again, that makes sense. A malefic rising, you could say, well, that's not good. But it's really kind of odd in a way. I mean, you can see how in the translation, the ruler versus being in the ascendant. I mean, that's a sort of a logical, those are sort of similar in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a connection there with the ascendant. And this is sort of a house-based kind of thing, isn't it? Because we're talking about the ascendant, and we get into definitely with the first and seventh houses. But it is really wacky that this idea, I guess what you were looking at here, and I think the other thing to think about might be that the sun and the moon in the exact degree is going to be the new moon, right? And the sun and moon in opposition is the full moon. So that may well be what we're dealing with here, because when you sort of translate it into astrological terms, when we're looking at a chart, you would tend to look at the conjunction or opposition of it. But I think the root of it might be, this is the syzygy, right? The full moon or the new moon. So if you're born at a full moon, exactly at a new moon or exactly at a full moon, then that's obviously a significant point. And then what you're looking for is the malefic or benefic rising. So that's what I would say. My deduction, I'm thinking about this, is that really what this is about is being born at the full moon or the new moon. And so that's like unusual thing to have happen. So that points that up. And if you've got a benefic rising or ruling the ascendant, great. If you got a malefic, then that's bad for you. So I think that's, if I was going to scan through that, that's kind of the roots of what this is about. Interesting. I've never really heard it before, and don't use it myself in natal delineation, but that would be, just in thinking about it, that's kind of how I would come down and kind of analyze what this is all about.
And I want to echo a little bit about Coley messing with things and changing them, because he forces the placement of the sun and the moon. And he's like, the sun needs to be in the east or the west, and the moon needs to be in the east or the west. That means that it would be in the ascendant as well, or right there if they really wanted to kind of do that. So you have Coley again kind of messing with it. And it's interesting because that's kind of how techniques change over time. And I wonder why Coley did that, if it was he was glossing through things or if there was some experimentation involved. And then I have another question for you, because I know that the prenatal lunation,
syzygy,
it factors into things like the name of the holy guardian angel, and it comes into play in a bunch of earlier techniques. How is that typically used in the other techniques it appears in?
I mean, like you said, it's a high legal point, right? And so there's these various points in the chart that can potentially be, because you've got the heilig and alcockidon, which are these various points or significators that are used in the length of life calculation. And the heiligal points are potential points that could be the heilig. And I think you go through them and you look at them to see which is the strongest. I mean, that's the typical Arabic Almutin technique, is to look at, which to determine the strongest and use that as the Almutin. So, but in terms of calculating the heilig or alcockidon, I'd have to go back and look at that, because I don't do it. I had someone recently say, "Can you tell me how long I'm going to live?" And I'm like, "No." So that was a short email conversation with them, because I'm not able to accurately time doing these. I think the best you could come up with that length of life stuff would be that this is a crisis point, and I think that would make sense. But the prenatal syzygy, it sounds really cool, but basically all it is the full moon or new moon immediately previous to birth. And the main use that I make of it, because for astrological magic, is just like you said, it's one of the points that I used to pinpoint the guardian angel name. So the degree of the prenatal syzygy is going to be a certain, letter, right? And that will be, one of the letters. It's actually the last of the 5 letters of the guardian angel name. But the natal, once we get into like arcane natal techniques, then that starts to get out of my normal, the way I would be doing it. I mean, this is probably written in the 12th or 13th century, which is a little bit earlier in terms of the technique that I do. When I do natal, it's very horary based. It's very house based. Whereas the older stuff would have a lot of funky, like this, you'd go through and you have this funky technique, right? That's sort of out of nowhere in a way. It's almost isolated, and to determine various things. And that's typical of a medieval, like a Bonatti natal delineation. So again, this is a little mysterious, and I'm not sure where it comes from. I can sort of see what they're getting at. I think that would be my hypothesis. But certainly this is a technique that you'd have to work with and look at. But here's the thing about it. This is going to be very rare. I mean, the number of people that are going to even be born with the sun and moon at the same minute, even Cazimi, is going to be unusual. I mean, when I do Cazimi moon talismans, it can be very hard to find. I think we may have one this year, but it's, there can be years go by before I can actually make a Cazimi moon talisman. It will happen once a month, right? Because the moon's going to go through the zodiac once a month. So you got 12 opportunities every year, but getting it set up so that you can even do a talisman, and someone being born at that time and having a benefic rising or having this opposition stuff is going to be a much more unusual circumstance. You could probably figure out statistically how often that could even happen. But it's going to be rare. So sometimes the stuff is like, they'll put it in there and it's not necessarily something that happens that often. So lots of interesting stuff, lots of thoughts that have kind of come up about this particular aphorism. But that's what's great about these. They really do provoke. They can be very thought-provoking.
I kind of want to step in and discuss partly why it's so hard to get that Cazimi in a talisman, because you also want to line that up on the Ascendant or the Midhaven. And it's moving so fast that you're not guaranteed that you'll be able to get that placement. That's part of why it's so rare to line that up.
If I'm going to do Cazimi, right, I'm going to want to do a talisman where the moon is strong. So it's going to be Taurus or Cancer, right? So that's only going to happen twice a year because the sun is only going to be in Taurus or Cancer, once, for the moon to go around. So that's 2 opportunities out of a year. And then, as you say, to get it rising, because with Cazimi, it's one of those situations where I don't necessarily get too. Sometimes I'll relax a little bit and allow the moon not to be rising or culminating because it's so difficult to get it Cazimi. And then if you're trying to get the hour too, that's really, I think I've actually done that. I think I've done, rising or culminating or whatever. The other way to do Cazimi is to do a house-based talisman. And I think that's one of the ones we have coming up this year. Is it's an interesting house-based talisman as well in terms of doing stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of the permutation. I think this is not really an example of Cazimi. I think this is more an example of a perfect new moon, right? Or a perfect full moon. And I think that's probably what the focus is on.
Well, absolutely. I'm more of the opinion of Ashmand and Partridge as far as having the actual planet, the malefic or benefic, in that rising sign. Because if you have that in, it's more urgently there, is the way I typically delineate that. So good things are coming to that person or part of that person. And I can see the argument being made for, if it's ruled by a benefic or a malefic, then you could kind of do it the way that Coley does it. But I always interpret that as that's what that person's focused on. They'll experience good things, but they'll have to chase them down. But again, that's my delineation. That's not necessarily how you would do it or how anyone else would do it. It's just a point of discussion.
What's interesting that I think that brings up an interesting point is that the chart has got a lot of stuff all mashed together, right? If you look at a chart, you've got, for example, the fact that the zodiac is kind of layered over local space, right? The 12 mundane houses are very much dependent on your local space and local location. So the ascendant is, if you went outside and looked at the horizon, that's the ascendant. If you look directly overhead, that's the 10th house, et cetera, et cetera. So something else that's going on here along with the house stuff is that you've got the original sort of angularity placement of the planets within that, rising, though that has its own sort of, which gets stuck together with the house meanings. The first house is, yourself, the second house is wealth, things like that. But the placement of a planet as being angular or succeeding or cadent is really actually a different sort of modality really that we're looking at. So when I think about this, I just have the sense of that since we're dealing with the full moon and new moon, right? And it's a less of a house-based kind of thing that we're really looking at. Really, I think it has more to do with the angularity. And so I tend to agree that I think the rising is probably more natural. But, again, the ruling the first house is going to be, it seems like if you have a benefic ruling the first house, that's good too. What this is doing is saying this point, if you're born at the exact moment of the new moon or the exact moment of the full moon, that's really special, right? And so, but the nature of that is going to be then determined by this benefic or this malefic that's then, that's on the horizon. And so, particularly if, you've got the moon and the sun and the moon in the first and seventh houses, right? This really is focusing on that placement too. So again, there's different ways to play it, but it just kind of resonates with me in terms of the placement, in local space and angularity and strength, as opposed to necessarily being the house meaning stuff either, though either one could be. So, but this is the thing, again, it's a mystery. They're not giving us any more information about this. This has also been passed down probably, When this was written down, it was just like, well, I read it and there's like 15 other books or whatever, this tradition told me that, and I just put it in there. And that's another thing that's interesting about the traditional astrology, is that they're not insistent on, I don't understand this, so I'm going to throw it out. I mean, that's the way modern people tend to be, is that if they don't have an explanation that fits them, they just toss it. It's just trash. Whereas a traditional approach would be like, well, this is what Abu Jafar says, or, whatever, we're just going to stick it in there and leave it in there. And, even though we don't necessarily understand it, we're still going to leave that in there and respect the tradition. And maybe we'll figure it out eventually as to why. But we have enough respect for the tradition that we'll put it in there. So again, that's another a lot of interesting points, and I think that this is that's why the aphorisms are a great jumping off point for a lot of interesting discussion.
Well, I think that we've done a pretty good job of covering this one. And so we will see all of y'all. You get a double feature for the next one.